Thank you, host. Assalamu alaikum, and a very good morning to all of you. Of hot morning as usual, but this is what you expect at the peak of the summers. Okay. So last time we finished off with the development of pharyngeal arches, a very important topic I told you, and now we start with the development of the organs of special senses, in which we will do the development of the eye and the development of ear. You've already done the gross anatomy of the eye, so things will look easier to you. Okay. Last time we did the sources of development of the eye. I'll just quickly run through them. No explanations needed for the time being. We'll do them one by one. The sources include the developing from the neuroectoderm of the forebrain. We have the retina, the posterior layer of iris, and the optic nerve. From the surface ectoderm of the head develops the lens and the corneal epithelium. Then you have mesoderm between the surface ectoderm and the neuroectoderm. Developing from this mesoderm, you have the fibrous cord and the vascular cord. And now, last but not the least, neural crest cells, which are present everywhere in the head and neck, practically, even in other places. But from the neural crest cells, you have the development of choroid, sclera, and corneal epithelium. Okay. During the 4th week of development, the eye begins to develop in the 4th week of intrauterine life. During this time, this is the developing forebrain. Here, this is the developing forebrain. Okay, neural tube. Here you can see the somites, notochord. Okay, the cranial end, you have neural folds, thickened neural folds. और आपको पता है, the neural tube opens into the exterior, that is, the neural tube opens into the amniotic cavity, or it communicates with the amniotic cavity by 2 openings. These 2 openings are called neuropore, that close 2 days apart, cranial and caudal neuropore. This is just a quick recap from what you did in first year, general embryology. So these are the thickened neural folds. This is the inside of the tube. This is the outside of the neural tube. Up this end is most cranial end of the neural tube, and this is where the forebrain is to develop. And I hope you remember in your first year when you did the subdivisions of the brain, even आपने जब physio वाले ने the physiology people did they taught you neurophysiology. I'm sure they must have told you that diencephalon is the most cranial part of the neural tube. So this is the part where you have the forebrain or the diencephalon. So thickening of the neural tube, the cranial most end. Now on the inside of this thickening, you have this groove. This is called optic groove. You see it from the inside. Okay? So this optic groove or the optic sulcus, one on either side. Yeah. Okay? This is the cavity of the diencephalon or cavity of the forebrain, and rising from the cavity of the forebrain, you have this groove on the inside. With the closure of neuropores, anterior neuropore. With the closure of anterior neuropore, when this closes, this entire thing, when it closes, so this sulcus evaginates. ये जो sulcus है, this evaginates like this. Here. To begin with, it was just a groove, but then this groove evaginated, protruded out. Just show you what I mean. Okay? So this sulcus evaginates. This evagination produces something, a structure like this, which is the distal end of this evaginated structure is expanded, but the proximal end is narrowed. This evaginated structure with its dilated distal end, this dilated distal end is called optic vesicle. This optic vesicle grows into the surrounding mesenchyme. I told you the other day, this is the epithelium of the developing forebrain in this case. This is the surrounding mesenchyme, and on the outside is ectoderm. Okay. So this optic vesicle, this is the developing optic vesicle. This grows into the surrounding mesenchyme. The formation of this optic vesicle, why is it formed? It is formed because this mesenchyme induces the forebrain, the optic vesicles, to grow deeper and become this structure, which is optic vesicles. जो optic grooves हैं, they are induced by the overlying mesenchyme to develop into optic vesicles. अच्छा जी, so this is what I meant. ये तो midbrain हो गया ना. This part would be the forebrain, especially this over here. And these are the two outpocketings. This is the outpocketing, the developing and outpocketing from the forebrain. ये सारा forebrain है. This is the cut part. So from forebrain, there is this outpocketing that grows into the surrounding mesenchyme. The pink is all mesenchyme, and blue is just evagination from the forebrain. Now, the optic vesicle, as it grows further, the distal end of the optic vesicle, this becomes expanded. However, this proximal end, the end which is attached to the forebrain, this part, this remains narrower. Okay? So, this distal part is called optic vesicle. This narrower part is called optic stalk. Because the distal part is optic vesicle, this narrower part with which this optic vesicle is attached to the forebrain, this elongates and then becomes what is called optic stalk. Now, by the end of the 4th week, the optic vesicle comes in contact with the surface ectoderm. This is the surface ectoderm. This is the surface ectoderm. So as this expands, as the optic vesicle, as it expands, the distal end of this optic vesicle, as it dilates, it grows laterally towards the surface ectoderm, and then it comes in contact with the surface ectoderm. Now, when it comes in contact with the surface ectoderm in this region, in the region where the optic vesicle comes in contact with the surface ectoderm, this area of the surface ectoderm, this gets thickened. This thickened area of surface ectoderm, which is overlying the optic vesicle, this thickened area is called lens placode. This lens placode is formed because the optic vesicle induces the overlying ectoderm to proliferate and become thickened and develop into a lens placode. This is the fuchsia lens. We'll do this a little later, but this is how the beginning of development of lens. Continuing with the eye, still with the eye, not the individual parts of the eye. Now I'm so sorry. So by the fourth week, we have the optic vesicle. We have the optic vesicle coming in contact with the surface ectoderm, and we also have the thickening of surface ectoderm to form the lens placode. ये तो events they were in the fourth week. Fifth week में क्या होता है? Fifth week में the optic vesicle, ये. Now this optic vesicle invaginates, deepens. ठीक है? When it invaginates, this part becomes cup-shaped. This is called optic cup. अब ये double layered हो गई. This is the outer layer and this is the inner layer. And together we have the formation of the optic cup. ठीक है? I repeat once again. The optic vesicle invaginates and becomes double layered. This invaginated part is called optic cup. It has two layers, an inner layer and outer layer. A double layered optic cup. The inner layer, this develops into the neural part of retina, or this part, this develops into the pigment part of the retina. Neural part is that part which has all the neurons of the retina. That is why it's called neural part. Now the two layers, this is the inner layer of the optic cup and the outer layer of the optic cup. They are continuous at this level over here. इसको हम कहते हैं the lip of the optic cup. So this is the lip of the optic cup where the two layers, the inner and outer layers of the optic cup, they become continuous with each other. So the outer layer, the lip of the optic cup, the outer layer continues as the inner layer. And the two layers, these outer and inner layer, the two layers you can see are separated by a space, intraretinal space. And please also note that this is simply the space that is continuous with the forebrain, the space of the inside the forebrain. Okay. This is the drawing taken from Landman. It's a beautiful drawing. Abhi aapko samajh aayegi. This is the optic cup. The whole structure is the optic cup. This is the outer layer of the optic cup, and on the inside you have the inner layer of the optic cup. The outer layer, I just told you, develops into the pigment part of the retina, and this inner layer is thick and develops into the neural part of the retina. And the two layers, the outer and the inner layers, are continuous over here. This is the margin of the optic cup. ये इसका section दिखाए हुए, taken a cut section from here, or it may be here, whatever you call this. ये optic cup, two layers, inner layer, outer layer. Outer layer, please note, is thin, developing into pigment layer. Inner layer is thick, developing into neural layer. And between the two, you have intraretinal space. So this is the intraretinal space that is continuous with the cavity of the forebrain. Okay. Now, one more thing happening in the fifth week. That is that ये optic stalk है. This part, optic stalk, I told you, as the optic vesicle, as it enlarges, dilates, the distal end dilates, the proximal end remains narrow, and as it grows laterally, this part, the optics, this narrowed part elongates and develops into what is called optic stroke. So here, this is the optic cup, optic vesicle, जिसमें optic cup develop होगी, and this is the optic stalk. Now what happens is that towards the end of fifth week, on the inferior surface of the optic stalk, you have the development of the optic groove, a linear structure called optic groove, inferior surface. Okay. This part is called choroid fissure. This groove of fissure, whatever you want to call it, that is developing on the inferior surface of the optic stalk, this is called choroid fissure. This is the O. Okay? This is the choroid fissure. I hope you appreciate that the choroid fissure brings the inside of the retina, brings the inside of the optic vesicle to the exterior. Yeah. यहाँ पे develop होगा. Okay. What is present up surrounding this optic cup? You have mesenchyme. Okay. This is the optic cup. Surrounding the optic cup, you have mesenchyme. All over. So this mesenchyme simply pushes into the over here in the optic cup as well at a later date, and into the choroid fissure as well. This mesenchyme that pushes into the choroid fissure is vascular mesenchyme and develops into hyaloid artery later on. अभी तक समझ में आया? Any questions so far? I suppose not. अब आ जाते हैं इस पे hyaloid artery. So हमने कहा था this is the optic stalk. इसके inferior surface पे a groove developed which is called choroid fissure. इस groove में ये जो surrounding mesenchyme है, this enters into the groove, develops into hyaloid artery. Now this hyaloid artery, what does it supply? Why has God made this hyaloid artery? This hyaloid artery supplies the inner layer of optic cup. Yeah. This is the hyaloid artery. It supplies the inner layer of the optic cup. It supplies this lens vesicle. Yeah. And it also supplies the mesenchyme in the optic cup. Okay. And obviously, जहाँ पे artery है, वहाँ पे you're going to have the vein. This hyaloid vein then drains these structure, and obviously it moves back. Okay. Now, 7th week, the lips of this choroid fissure, they fuse. And as they do so, this hyaloid artery is trapped inside the optic stroke. This is the proximal part. Sorry, distal part, the proximal part. Closer to the blood vessel is the proximal part. Origin of the blood vessel is the proximal part. Hyaloid artery is a branch of ophthalmic artery. The proximal part of the hyaloid artery, which is lying in the optic stalk, that part develops into the central artery of the retina. और ये जो इसका distal part है, which is lying inside the eye, this part then degenerates. So the proximal part, which is lying inside the eye, this part, this degenerates. However, sorry, I'm so sorry. However, this part, which is lying inside the optic stalk, entering from the choroid fissure, ये part, which is trapped inside the optic stalk, ये part persist करता है and develops into central artery of the retina, which you know is a branch of the ophthalmic artery. अभी आपने किया है. Now comes the development of the lens. Any questions so far? Any questions? I don't think there are any questions. But I had to ask you. Again. Okay, so let's come back and start with the development of the lens. It all began when this dilated optic vesicle came in contact with the surface ectoderm. The surface ectoderm proliferated, became thickened, and that structure, thickened surface ectoderm, is now called lens plate coat. We're going back. Okay, lens ki development starts in the 4th week. This thickened surface ectoderm then invaginates. Up deep to it, ये optic vesicle पड़ा हुआ था, और हमने already कर लिया है कि this optic vesicle invaginates. ये optic vesicle है. This has invaginated to form the optic cup. Okay. ये जो when the optic vesicle, when this invaginates, the overlying lens plate coat or the thickened ectoderm, this also invaginates. This invaginated thickened surface ectoderm or the lens plate coat, this invaginated part is called lens pit. So this is the lens pit. The pit, as the cup deepens, the lens pit also deepens. Then as they deepen, the two edges or the two lips of the lens vesicle, they come close to each other, they approach each other, and then they fuse with each other. So the lens pit, when the edges of the lens pit, they fuse with each other, the structure that develops is called lens vesicle. Okay? So fifth week में ये जो lens vesicle है, अभी तक this is the surface ectoderm and this is the thickened part of the surface ectoderm, which is the lens placode and then lens pit and lens vesicle, all developing from the surface ectoderm. But when it becomes a complete circle, lens vesicle, then gradually, by the fifth week, it loses its connection with the surface ectoderm. So lens separate ho jata hai, surface ectoderm becomes a separate structure, even though once upon a time the lens this developed as part of the surface ectoderm. Okay? So if there's a question about the development of the lens, please remember the lens developed as a thickened surface ectoderm. Sorry, that was just a sip of water. Acha ji. Now, all this area is surrounded by mesenchyme. So, as the lens vesicle, as it develops, it sinks down deeper into what is called the optic cup. Okay? This is a vesicle, the two lips approaching each other. So this is a cavity inside the lens, developing lens. This is the cavity inside the developing lens. Here. This is the cavity, this is the developing lens. So it has two walls, an anterior wall, it has a posterior wall. Okay? अभी इसकी later on discuss करते हैं कि ये thickening कैसे हो रही. But just remember, you have an anterior wall, you have a posterior wall. The two walls are lined by, to begin with, they are lined by epithelium, which is uniform in thickness. यहाँ पे आपको ये thicken दिखाई हुई है. This is a later stage. To begin with, the epithelium of the lens is surrounding the inside, lining the inside of the lens, and it is of uniform thickness all over. Cuboidal epithelium होती है all over. ठीक है? इस cuboidal epithelium की please एक बात याद रखिए. On the outside you have the basement membrane here, and the epithelium is inside. ये epithelium is resting on this basement membrane which is outside. ये बात आप याद रखिए. Okay? अच्छा जी. अब I told you ये lens vesicle है, ये cavity of the lens vesicle है, and this is the cuboidal epithelium all around. But this is the anterior wall here, and this is the posterior wall. So what happens is, the epithelium of the posterior wall, this begins, पहले cuboidal थी, this begins to elongate here, and gradually begins to fill the cavity of the lens vesicle. Epithelium on the posterior wall begins to elongate and gradually begins to fill the cavity of the vesicle, the lens vesicle. Abhi tak you can see the nuclei present over here. But then by the 7th week, these cells lose their nuclei. when they lose when any cell, when it loses its nuclei, it loses its ability to multiply. So now the cell cannot multiply because it loses these cells that line the posterior wall of the lens, these cells that become columnar. They lose their nuclei and since they lose their ability to multiply, they are called primary lens cells or primary lens fibers. With further development, proteins get developed into these cells, these enucleated cells without nuclei. They get filled with protein, crystalline kind of protein. That is why these cells, fibers called lens fibers, they become transparent. Okay? However, the anterior lens epithelium, this does not elongate. This continues to remain pure. Approximately at this level, at the equator, अब आपको पता है where the equator is. Equator is running around the Earth. So any ball, a rounded ball like the Earth, has an equator. Okay? At the equator, cells divide. At the equator, cells have retained their nuclei. On the inside, deeper inside, cells have lost their nuclei and are filled with crystalline protein. Gradually, more cells develop on the surface at the equator. These cells also later on lose their nuclei and become secondary lens fibers. Okay? Now, the secondary lens fibers are formed external to the primary lens fibers. Primary lens fibers also lose their nuclei. Secondary lens fibers also lose their nuclei. So now, इनकी further division अब नहीं होगी. However, they continue to elongate. As the lens grows in size, these cells, they do elongate, stretch करते चले जाते हैं with the increase in size of the lens. Sorry. Actually, continuing with the lens, this is the developing lens. This is the optic cup. The two layers, the inner layer of the optic cup, the outer layer of the optic cup, and lying inside the optic cup is mesenchyme. Because I told you, mesenchyme is everywhere. And entering the lips of the optic cup was the mesenchyme. And this is the lens that developed from the surface to the. Okay. I just told you that the basement membrane of the developing lens, that was on the outside and cells were lying on the inside of the basement membrane. Okay. ये जो basement membrane है ना, this gets thickened. This thickened basement membrane all around, this is called lens capsule. Lens capsule is simply development of simply the basement membrane that surrounds the lens, developing lens. And on the outside, this is mesenchyme. This surrounding mesenchyme on the posterior aspect. The mesenchyme on the posterior aspect, surrounding the posterior aspect of the lens. This develops into a structure which is called tunica vasculosa lentis. Yeah. This is simply mesenchyme surrounding the posterior aspect of the lens and develops into tunica vasculosa lentis. Anterior pathway, anterior aspect way, this mesenchyme develops into iridopupillary membrane. And the vessels, blood vessels, associated with the iridopupillary membrane. So ये जो mesenchyme है all around the lens. On the posterior aspect, it develops into tunica vasculosa lentis, this one, and on the anterior aspect, yeah, यही mesenchyme, this develops into iridopupillary membrane, and the blood vessels associated with the iridopupillary membrane. By this time, this hyaloid artery, this disappears. यहाँ पे persist करेगी stalk में, but inside the cavity of the cup, ये hyaloid artery disappear कर जाती है. However, this is replaced by anterior ciliary artery, and that is the supply. Retina कर लेते हैं. अच्छा जी, तो हमने बात की थी ऑप्टिक कप की, ठीक है? So we said that the optic cup was simply formed by the invagination of the optic vesicle. But optic vesicle was a continuation of this optic stalk. This is the intraretinal space, which is simply a continuity of the optic stalk, continues with the optic stalk. और ये जो optic stalk है, ये आपको पता है, this is simply continuous with the cavity of the forebrain. So ये जो optic vesicle है, I hope you appreciate that this optic vesicle is simply outgrowth from the forebrain. ठीक है? अब हम retina पे आ जाते हैं. Optic cup invaginates, 2 layers, outer layer, inner layer. The 2 layers continues over here at the lips of the optic cup. यहाँ पे the outer layer becomes continuous with the inner layer, and between the outer layer and the inner layer you have this space which is called intraretinal space. This intraretinal space will later on disappear when the outer layer comes in contact with the inner layer and fuses with the inner and outer layer fuse with each other and obliterate this. With the fusion, this intraretinal space, this disappears. ये जो outer layer है ना, this develops into the pigment layer of the retina. The inner layer develops into the neural layer of the retina. और यहाँ ये जो lips है, where the outer layer becomes continuous with the inner layer, ये जो edges कह लें या इसके lips कह लें, this develops into ciliary body and iris. Ciliary body and iris both are parts of your choroid, middle layer of the wall of the eyeball. अब ये जो outer layer है ना, this will develop melanin pigment. That is why it is called pigment layer. Okay? So the pigment that develops over here is melanin. Okay, let's talk about the inner layer, this layer. To begin with, you have just 2 types of cells. These are neuroblasts. So ये के जो cells present over here are neuroblasts. G. नहीं, that is where you're confused. बेटा lens placode जो है, this invaginates, deepens और वो lens cup or the lens vesicle when the 2 layers of the lens के, I'll go back. Thank you for asking me this question. बेटा ये सरफेस एक्टोडर्म थी, ठीक है, ये थिकन हुई एंड दिस डेवलप्स इनटू लेंस, लेंस प्लेट। ये जो है, if I go back still further, ऑप्टिक वेसिकल पे आ जाते हैं, here optic vesicle. This is simply evagination of the forebrain. ये forebrain है. This is the cavity of the forebrain. From the cavity of the forebrain, there is an evagination. This evagination develops into optic vesicle. ठीक है? So optic vesicle is simply the evagination of forebrain. जबकि lens vesicle जो develop हुआ है, ये optic vesicle is formed by the evagination of forebrain, जो जबकि lens vesicle thickening of surface ectoderm. ऑप्टिक वेसिकल भी इन्वेजिनेट किया, डबल लेयर्ड कप बना. अब ये फोरब्रेन की एक्सटेंशन है, ये है फोरब्रेन की एक्सटेंशन है ऑप्टिक वेसिकल. जबकि लेंस जो है, ये थिकनिंग जो थी, ये थिकनिंग इन्वेजिनेट की, अंदर की तरफ टर्न करके. When this thickening of the ectoderm, when this turns inside, inwards, then the lips of this invagination, they fuse with each other and they develop into lens vesicle. पहले लेंस पिट बनती है, ये लेंस पिट बनी थी, फिर लेंस वेसिकल बना, और लेंस वेसिकल then loses its connection with the surface. So बच्चे, ये जो ऑप्टिक कप है, this will develop later into retina, जो अब हम बता रहे हैं. This develops from the lens, from the optic vesicle, और optic vesicle forebrain की extension है, जबकि जो लेंस है ये surface ectoderm से बना है. ये इस surface ectoderm that comes in contact with optic vesicle. अब बात क्लियर हुई है? अब बात क्लियर हुई है? ओके, थैंक यू. अब ये जो ऑप्टिक वेसिकल है, जो कि फोरब्रेन से बना है, गॉड ब्लेस यू माय डियर. नाउ वी आर टॉकिंग अबाउट दिस ऑप्टिक कप. ठीक है, हम इस ऑप्टिक कप की बात कर रहे हैं, हम इस ऑप्टिक कप की बात कर रहे हैं. ओके, लेंस की डेवलपमेंट हम कर चुके हैं. नाउ वी वर डूइंग द रेटिना. अब ये वही ऑप्टिक कप आ गया, ऑप्टिक कप इन्वेजिनेट कर गया. ये ऑप्टिक स्टॉक है जिसके साथ ऑप्टिक कप अटैच था. ठीक है, दिस इज द outer layer of the optic cup, this is the inner layer of the optic cup. The two layers, they join each other at the margins of the optic cup here, the lips of the optic cup over here. Acha. Between the two layers is this space which is called intraretinal space. Yeah. And this intraretinal space is continuous with the cavity of the forebrain via the optic stalk. ये optic stalk है, elongated part जो है. Okay. अब इसकी आगे डेवलपमेंट डिस्कस करते हैं बेटा. In the inner layer, the inner layer develops into the neural part of the retina. अभी आपको बताया था कि इस outer layer में you have the development of pigments in the outer layer. ये melanin pigment है that develop in the outer layer. Inner layer. Inner layer में you have the development of two types of neuron. ये outer side होगी, ये inner side होगी. So you have outer neuroblastic layer, inner neuroblastic layer. ठीक है, ये दो layers हो गए. अब out of all the cells of the retina, the ganglion cells, the amacrine cells, and horizontal cells, they are the first to develop. So they develop early. I repeat once again, the amacrine, the horizontal, and ganglion cells, they are the earlier ones to develop. जबकि later cells जो develop करते हैं उनमें molar cells होते हैं, rods होते हैं, and bipolar cells of the retina होते हैं. अभी हमने उस दिन olfactory tract किया था, and I told you कि olfactory tract के cells bipolar होते हैं. Sorry, olfactory bulb में हमने देखा था. They were bipolar cells in the olfactory bulb. Similarly, दूसरा एग्जाम्पल मैंने आपको रेटिना का दिया था. रेटिना के बीच जो सेल्स होते हैं दे आर बाइपोलर सेल्स, बाइपोलर न्यूरॉन्स. सॉरी, जस्ट अ सिप ऑफ वाटर. ठीक है जी. सो द लेटर सेल्स टू डेवलप आर द मोलर सेल्स, द रॉड सेल्स, एंड द बाइपोलर सेल्स ऑफ द रेटिना. द अर्लियर वंस टू डेवलप वर द हॉरिजॉन्टल सेल्स, द गैंग्लियन सेल्स, एंड द एमाक्राइन सेल्स. उसका ये मतलब नहीं है, प्लीज be clear about one thing. ये नहीं है कि इस this layer develops first, this layer develops earlier, later on, or this develops earlier, this develops later. ये नहीं है. Layer wise development नहीं है. It is cell wise development. क्योंकि ये different layers के cells हैं and they develop accordingly. Okay. Continuing with the development of the retina. Along with the cells, two types of membranes also develop. ये neural part of the retina की बात कर रहे हैं. ठीक है. ये जो दो membranes हैं, you have the outer limiting membrane, ये वाली. This one, this is the outer limiting membrane, and this is the inner limiting membrane, ये वाली. Okay. The outer limiting, this is ये तो choroid है ना, इसमें blood vessels आपको नजर आ रही हैं. This is pigment cell layer, इसमें आपको pigments नजर आ रहे हैं. ठीक है. Pigment cell layer. So the outer limiting membrane, this one, this is the outer nuclear layer. मैं फिर repeat कर देती हूँ. This is part of the choroid, so इसको आप भूल जाएंगे. Histologically, this is part of the choroid. All this from here to here. Okay. From here starts the retina. ये pigment cell layer है. Then you have the outer limiting membrane. अभी outer nuclear layer. ठीक है. First layer of nuclear cells जो हैं, neurons जो हैं, first layer of neurons. उनकी आपको nuclei नजर आ रहे हैं. Then comes the outer plexiform layer. This is the inner nuclear layer, cells of the second layer of neurons. उनके आगे से आप processes forming the inner plexiform layer. And then you have a specialized kind of cells, which are the ganglion cell layers. And in ganglion cell layers, then you have the axons in this layer, nerve fiber layer, that form the optic nerve. And outside all this, the inner limiting membrane. I hope you appreciate one thing. This is the outer side. This is the inner surface. The inner membrane, inner limiting membrane lines the inside of the innermost layer. Okay. Now, you have two membranes, one on the outside, one on the inside. The outer membrane, the outer limiting membrane, the external limiting membrane, whatever name you want to give it, here. This membrane, ये तो pigment cell layer है ना? ये, this outer limiting membrane is lying between pigment epithelium and the first layer of neurons, outer nuclear layer. जबकि जो inner limiting membrane है, that is lining the inside of the retina, neural part of the retina. And अब रहेगी ये layer, ganglion cell layer, इस पे आ जाते हैं. Axons from this layer, they make up the optic nerve. ठीक है? They all collect together and enter into the optic stalk. Let's come to that a little in a while. First, let's finish with the retina. Fifth month, by the fifth month, all the layers of the retina have developed. The retinal pigment epithelium, on one side it is attached to choroid, on the other side you have the neural, the cavity of the optic cup. Remember one thing, this attachment between the pigment epithelium and the neural layer of retina, this is not a firm attachment. Okay? So as a result, this attachment goes on, may break in cases of trauma or in disease. This attachment between the inner and between the pigment and the neural layer of retina is, since it is not firm, it may simply break down because of trauma, and the result is what is called retinal detachment. ये अभी हम इसको in detail करेंगे. I'll quickly do with the optic nerve and then leave it, because there isn't much in the optic nerve. Actually, so this was the optic cup and this was the optic stalk. And I told you that surrounding the optic cup is the mesenchyme, all over, surrounding all this optic cup, stalk, whatever. Surrounding this is the mesenchyme. Okay? This is the outer layer of the optic cup. This is the inner layer of the optic cup. And this, the inner layer and the outer layer meet over here. Now, seventh, ye optic stalk, and on the inferior surface or the ventral surface of the optic stalk, you have the development of this fissure, which is called choroid fissure. When this choroid fissure develops, I hope you okay, then is inside the fissure also you have this is the outer layer and this is the inner layer. This extends into the choroid fissure as well. And as I said earlier on, this mesenchyme enters into the optic, into the choroid fissure, and this is vascular mesenchyme that develops into hyaloid blood vessels. Now, this is the inner layer of the optic cup. Ye wali layer. The inner layer of the optic cup, innermost layer I told you was the ganglion cell layer. Abhi aapko bataya tha. And this ganglion cell layer, iske jo axons hain, they develop into optic nerve fibers. So this is the area where you have the ganglion cell layer. The axons of these cells, ganglion cells, they pass into the optic stalk from all over, yahan se, from all over. Axons lining the retina, innermost layer of the retina, they pass into the optic stalk. They pass over here. And from there it enters into the brain, because iske andar jo cavity thi, The cavity over here is continuous to the cavity of the brain. Yeah. Okay. ये hyaloid artery इसके अंदर ये intraretinal space थी. We are talking about this layer, the innermost layer, the ganglion cell layer. उसके axons जो हैं, they pass into the choroid fissure. ये जो drawing है, this is given in lanyard. A beautiful drawing that explains a lot. Okay. Now, as the retina grows, as the eye grows in size, more and more neurons are added to it. And when more neurons are added to it, more nerve fibers are added to it. The more axons that form the optic nerve, more of them are added to this optic stalk. And finally, the optic stalk is full of nerve fibers arising from the cells over here, and then the walls of this optic stalk fuse and this choroid fissure disappears. Okay? So this part develops into the optic nerve. Up, lying within this part was also the hyaloid artery over here, because the mesenchyme entered into the choroid fissure. So अब यहाँ पे axons of the nerve of ganglion cells है, plus यहाँ पे hyaloid artery है. This hyaloid artery later develops into the central artery of the retina. And you have mesenchyme all around. The mesenchyme in this area develops into the pia, arachnoid, and dura mater. So now you have the development of the optic nerve. Now you know why you have a blood vessel lying inside the optic nerve, because mesenchyme enters over here, develops into hyaloid artery. आपको मैंने बताया था कि hyaloid artery in this part, proximal part में persist करती है as central artery of the retina, लेकिन in the optic cup the hyaloid artery degenerates. Okay, so now you know why the optic nerve has the central artery of the retina running through it. Okay, I hope there is something. अभी चल रहा है, कोई बात नहीं. Last, possibly retina से related. अच्छा जी, myelination of the optic nerve is incomplete at the time of birth, around about the 10 weeks, at the age of 10 weeks of postnatal life, myelination is complete. So, लेकिन ये जो myelination है, this just goes up to the optic disc, उससे आगे नहीं. ठीक है? So that is why, since this is not myelinated, since it is not completely developed, the newborn, once baby is born, he or she cannot see well. Light perception है, light को respond करेगा, but they do not see figures well. Hazy सा figure होता है. Visual acuity at the time of birth is just 20/400. But later on, 2 weeks पे, they begin to appreciate large objects. उसको अपनी कमाल जो है, वो थोड़ा सा कोई खेला सा नजर आना शुरू हो जाता है. That is why they begin to smile as they grow older. They begin to smile because now they see objects. Okay, I will not do the development of the ciliary body today. Inshallah, next time. यहाँ पे, do we have any questions? Do we have any questions? Anything you want me to repeat? Any questions, Peter? Well, I've run out of time. The question here, so please, next time we'll start with question. Okay. So thank you very much. God bless you. We'll see you in an embryology class on Thursday and in a gross anatomy class on Monday, inshallah.